The morning he told me he wanted a divorce, he said it like he was doing me a favor. Like handing me a polite rejection slip after a job I had spent 2 decades proving I already knew how to do blindfolded, sleep-deprived, and grieving. He said it at the kitchen table, the one we'd built together from a salvage yard find, the one I had sanded and sealed myself while pregnant with our second son, the one where we'd shared Christmas breakfasts and budget talks and forgiveness over burnt dinner. He didn't even look up when he said it, just stirred his coffee, still in his flannel robe, and said, "It's not working anymore, Claire. I think we should separate. No affair, no fight, no visible bruise, just a casual dismantling of everything I had poured myself into like he was returning a faulty appliance." I didn't cry, not right then. I just asked, "Are you serious?" And he nodded like a man who had already packed the decision in his car 3 weeks ago and was only now telling me because the lease on his new life was about to start. I stood up, cleared the table, asked him if he was planning to tell the boys himself or if that, too, would be my burden to carry. He said we'd talk about that later, which meant never. Later always meant never with Robert. We'd been married 22 years. I'd followed him from base to base, from city to suburb, from job loss to job gain, through therapy, through pregnancies, through grief, and somehow I was the deadweight. He moved out 3 days later. Didn't take much. Just his suits, his golf clubs, and the boxes he'd clearly packed before our last anniversary. He said he'd be staying with a friend until things settled. That friend's name was on a wine glass I found in his suitcase. Tina. I didn't recognize the name at first, but I would later. I'd come to know it with a level of clarity I'd reserved for rattlesnakes and eviction notices. The boys took it as boys do. One stayed angry, the others stayed silent. I stayed still. For 2 weeks, I didn't move much, didn't clean, didn't cook, didn't even answer the phone. I just sat in the sunroom with a blanket over my knees and thought about all the versions of myself I had buried to make his life easier. The job I didn't take, the hobby I quit, the friendships I let fade, the way I'd learned to fold myself smaller and smaller so he could stretch without knocking into anything. And still, I wasn't enough. Then one morning, the front door opened, and I heard laughter. Female, sharp, too familiar. I stepped into the hallway and found Tina there, her heels clicking on my hardwood floors, her hand wrapped around Robert's arm, like she'd paid for the foundation and poured the cement herself. I said, "You're in the wrong house." She smiled like she wasn't. Robert said, "I thought we agreed I'd keep the house." "We didn't agree," I said. "You decided." And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't a breakup. This was a robbery in slow motion. He hadn't left. He was circling, waiting for me to give up the deed like a tired queen surrendering the castle. But what he didn't know was I had already made a call. To a lawyer, to a broker, to a very old friend who specialized in very quiet revolutions. I smiled that morning for the first time in weeks, because if he wanted the house he was going to get it, just not the way he thought. And when it was over, he and Tina would be right where they belonged. Outside, with nowhere to go, because this house didn't just hold my memories, it held my name, and soon it would hold my revenge. By the time the ink dried on the divorce papers, Robert had already moved Tina into my house like she was a prize he'd earned for surviving 2 decades of mild inconvenience. And every time I pulled into the driveway after work, I saw her car parked in the spot where I used to sit in silence and cry during lunch breaks, wondering how I'd ended up loving someone who couldn't remember the last time he looked me in the eyes without scanning for a flaw. And it wasn't just that he replaced me. It was how quickly, how smugly, how he paraded her around the neighborhood like she was a gold medal, and I had been the training wheels. And I'll never forget the first time I caught them throwing a barbecue in my backyard. Tina, in my apron, laughing too loudly, turning burgers with the spatula I'd bought at our first farmer's market, while Robert stood beside her with one hand on her hip and the other raising a glass like he'd won something. And I stood at the kitchen window, watching them live in a fantasy where I was already erased, where my name on the deed meant nothing. where the walls I painted, the furniture I restored, the garden I planted, were suddenly their set pieces in a show I'd been kicked out of without warning or credits, and the thing that made it unbearable wasn't the audacity, it was the comfort. The way they moved through my space like it was their birthright. Like they had been chosen by the house itself to replace the woman who built it. And that was the moment I stopped grieving and started planning, not out of spite, but out of sheer necessity. Because I realized then that Robert never intended to start over. He intended to start fresh with my life, my resources, my sacrifices, repackaged under Tina's name. And I would not, under any circumstance, be written out of the story I had bled to write. So I went to the bank. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And I pulled every statement, every transaction, every record that could prove what was mine. Then I sat down with my lawyer and asked her to read the fine print on every agreement we'd ever signed, and what she found was this. The house was in my name, the mortgage was in my name, the equity line was solely mine, and Robert, in all his laziness and arrogance, had never filed to change it. Not during the marriage, not during the divorce, because in his mind, ownership was emotional and assumed, not legal and documented. And that, my friend, was his fatal mistake. Because I didn't scream, I didn't argue, I didn't post cryptic messages or cry in the arms of girlfriends over wine and he's not worth it stages. I filed a quiet motion to list the property, hired a broker who worked fast and asked no questions, staged the house to look just clean enough to move, just impersonal enough to sell, and while Tina was filming a video tour for her new lifestyle blog in the guest bathroom, talking about self-care and essential oils, the paperwork was already being signed downtown, notarized, stamped, and filed. And by the time they realized what I'd done, there would be no reversal, no emergency hearing, no time to pull the rug back over the hole they dug for themselves. Because I was selling the house right out from under them, cash buyer, no contingencies, close in 10 days, and all I had to do now was wait. Not because I was nervous, but because revenge, when served legally and quietly, tastes best with a long pour of satisfaction and a front row seat to the unraveling of their delusions. And as I watered the roses beneath the kitchen window that afternoon, watching Tina pose in her sundress and my husband, no, my ex-husband, grin like he had finally arrived, I smiled because they were already homeless. They just didn't know it yet. The day the house officially went under contract was the same day Tina posted a video titled, "Our Forever Home Reveal," complete with a staged kitchen tour, a sped-up montage of her rearranging throw pillows I had sewn by hand, and a caption that read, "Grateful for fresh starts and the people who make a house a home." And I watched it in full, all 7 minutes, with a mug of tea and the satisfaction of knowing she was narrating a lie built on land she didn't own, under a roof she was days away from being evicted from. And what made it almost poetic was that she really believed it. Believed this life was hers now, that a few filtered photos and lavender candles could scrub away the history that pulsed in every floorboard, that smiled in the photo frames she never even bothered to remove. And Robert, bless him, had the audacity to comment on the video with heart emojis and a line about new chapters while the ink on the sale agreement was barely dry. And what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that I had already signed over power of attorney to my lawyer for the closing, already cleared out the attic of what mattered, already rerouted my mail and updated my address with the bank, and every single move I made was deliberate, quiet, legal, and irreversible. And it wasn't revenge. Not really. It was reclamation, a word they wouldn't understand until the sheriff knocked on the door, and the funniest part, the most delicious little detail, was that I'd timed the closing for the day after their big engagement party, the one Tina had been planning for weeks, the one Robert's sister had emailed me about, by mistake, not realizing the guest list included a woman who still held the keys to their delusions, and I didn't correct her. Didn't respond. Didn't crash the event or make a scene. Instead, I watched from the comfort of my new apartment, a small but sun-drenched place with a balcony and a door that only opened for me, and I waited, calm and precise, for the moment the truth would arrive dressed in a county seal and legal backing. And when it did, it came at 9:07 a.m. On a Monday, while Tina was still in her robe and Robert was in the backyard shirtless, watering the grass like it owed him something, and, according to my lawyer, they didn't answer the door at first, just peeked through the blinds like children who knew they were about to be grounded. When the officer announced himself, they had no choice, and the look on Tina's face, my lawyer said it was like watching a woman realize her credit card had been declined in front of an audience. And Robert, of course, tried to argue, said it must be a mistake, said I would never do something like this. And she told him flatly, she didn't do anything illegal. You're the ones who stayed in a home that didn't belong to you. And the silence that followed was what I had waited for. Not the apology, not the admission, just the moment where their certainty collapsed under the weight of reality. And I didn't gloat, didn't call, didn't send a smug text. I just went on with my morning, folded laundry, opened a new savings account, made coffee, because when a woman has been dismissed for long enough, there's nothing sweeter than the quiet echo of consequences finally arriving on someone else's doorstep. And as I hung a new curtain in my little kitchen, soft linen with embroidered lemons, I whispered to myself, you thought I wouldn't fight, but you never saw me prepare. And that was the real truth. Not that they were losing the house, but that they had mistaken my silence for surrender. Now they would learn the difference between possession and ownership, between access and power, between living in a place and truly belonging to it. And by the end of that day, their forever home was nothing but a listing in someone else's inbox, and an embarrassment too large to filter, too permanent to ignore. The morning they were served the final move-out order, Tina posted a story with the caption, "Sometimes God closes doors so he can open French ones," and I nearly dropped my spoon in my cereal because the irony was so loud I swear it rattled the blinds. And there she was, posing in front of the very door she was legally obligated to vacate in less than 10 days, clutching a mug that said, Queen Energy, like it would pay the escrow balance, while Robert sulked in the background, blurry and hunched, probably already realizing that whatever fantasy he'd sold himself about smooth transitions and shared ownership was crashing harder than the stock market in '08. And I didn't have to gloat. Didn't need to make a single phone call, because the universe had a way of broadcasting humility loud and clear when you least expected it, and by noon, my realtor had sent over the walkthrough photos for the new buyers. Clean slate couple from Denver, newlyweds, cash buyers, no pets, no drama, just dreams. And I stared at those photos for a long time, not because I missed anything, but because I wanted to remember what peace looked like before it got trampled by entitlement. And the next day, Tina posted again. This time a quote about resilience and trusting the process. And I knew from the timing and tone that she had read the closing timeline, realized there were no legal loopholes, and was doing her best to manifest illusion into a loophole, but there was no spell strong enough to reverse a title transfer. No amount of faux empowerment that could undo a wire transfer to my account that hit like thunder on a clear day. And I didn't watch them pack, didn't stand on the sidewalk with crossed arms and a smirk, because that wasn't my energy anymore. My energy was quiet, grown, collected, the kind of calm that unsettles people who live loud and shallow. And when my realtor texted to ask if I wanted to return for a final walkthrough, I declined with a thank you and a smile, because that house wasn't mine anymore. Not the version they'd dirtied, not the rooms they'd defiled with cheap wine and cheaper behavior. I had extracted everything of value before the papers were even filed, and now it was just a shell being rebooted, and I hoped the new couple treated it with the grace it deserved, the kind I had given it for years while scrubbing the walls of his silence and painting over the cracks she would later blame on poor lighting. According to the sheriff's report, they left in a hurry, didn't say much, just loaded boxes, argued in the driveway, and peeled out of the neighborhood like fugitives from a life they thought they could steal. And I imagined Tina trying to hold on to her narrative, trying to explain to her followers why the forever home had a for sale sign in the photos just a month later. And Robert, probably embarrassed, probably angry, probably realizing too late that he should have listened when I said no the first time, back when he asked if I could be flexible on splitting the assets, back when he assumed I'd be too tired to care, too heartbroken to retaliate. But I had learned something about heartbreak. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it studies, sometimes it documents, Sometimes it waits, and when it strikes, it does so with precision and silence and legal backing. And I didn't need revenge. I didn't need them homeless. I just needed my power back. And if that meant they found themselves with no address, no plan, and no audience left to impress, then maybe, just maybe, they'd understand what it feels like to be left without warning, dismissed without ceremony, to be replaced by a signature and a decision you never saw coming. And as I sat on my new porch, sipping chamomile, watching the clouds drift slow, I thought, this is what grace looks like after war. It looks like space. It looks like stillness. It looks like letting the wind carry away the dust of people who thought you'd never leave, never fight back, never win. And oh, how wrong they were. They didn't show up to the final inspection, which didn't surprise me. Not after the tantrums, the Instagram subtweets disguised as healing quotes, and the last-ditch message Robert left on my voicemail saying, "I just think we should talk about this face to face," as if he hadn't moved another woman into my bedroom while my clothes were still hanging in the closet, as if he hadn't tossed 20 years of marriage into a box marked miscellaneous and handed it to me like charity, and I didn't return the call, because there was nothing left to say. Not after the sale closed, not after the check cleared, not after my lawyer confirmed the transfer was final and the keys belonged to someone who would never let Tina film herself cooking barefoot in someone else's memories again. And it wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about agency, about walking through the fire they set and emerging with my name not just intact, but and that first night in my new place, I didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't look at old photos or play sad music or whisper his name in regret. I unpacked one box, poured a glass of wine, and sat barefoot on my kitchen counter under the soft buzz of unfamiliar lights and felt the strange, wild comfort of starting over on my own terms, no compromises, no half-lived compromises disguised as partnership, no sharp-tongued women clinking glasses over the bones of my past. And in the weeks that followed, I didn't hear from them. Not directly, but I saw the ripple, the way our mutual acquaintances started liking my posts again, the way my name began surfacing in group chats like folklore. The woman who smiled while dismantling everything they tried to steal. And my realtor told me later that Robert tried to delay the final disbursement by sending a long, pitiful email about emotional distress and misunderstanding, to which she replied with a copy of the deed and the words, "Transaction completed. Please vacate all further correspondence," and that email alone felt like a chapter closing, like a door locking not behind me, but behind the woman I used to be, the one who begged to be understood, the one who thought loyalty was measured by how much pain you could survive in silence. Tina started posting about spiritual retreats and energy cleansing, as if sage could burn away a legally binding document in a public eviction. And I didn't comment, didn't screenshot, didn't gloat, because the best revenge isn't loud, it's unbothered. It's your name printed neatly on paperwork while theirs is reduced to a bitter footnote. And one afternoon I saw them in the grocery store parking lot, not together, not smiling, just passing each other like strangers with too much history and not enough courage, and he saw me. Of course he did, standing there with fresh flowers in one hand and a small smile I didn't have to force, and he looked away first, like he always did when things got too real. And I didn't chase, didn't wave, just turned my face toward the sun and let him walk into the shadow of his choices. And that night I lit a candle in my new living room, not for them, not for closure, but for the woman who finally stopped folding herself into corners to make room for other people's egos. Because she deserved light, she deserved space, she deserved to be the author of the final page. As I lay down to sleep, the silence wrapped around me like a vow. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of peace earned one signature, one boundary, one unapologetic choice at a time. That first holiday after the sale, Robert stayed silent. No texts, no apologies, not even a lazy, "hope you're well," and I spent it exactly how I wanted, alone but free, sipping cider in a quiet home that was finally mine, where peace didn't need permission, and when Tina sent a long, self-pitying letter from out of state, I didn't waste breath. I just folded it and filed it away with my peace of mind. And a few weeks later, when one of Robert's old coworkers asked if I was okay, I smiled and said, "Better than I've ever been," because healing without performance is its own reward. And by January, I'd made a list of truths. One of them being, never confuse access with ownership again. And as I planted bulbs on my balcony and found joy in small things like humming or sunlight, I knew I wasn't rebuilding, I was rising. And when I found the old anniversary locket, I didn't cry. I donated it because the past no longer held me. And as the day closed, I realized I wasn't the woman who got left. I was the woman who walked away. Spring came like a soft reset, and by March I was volunteering at the Women's Center, not for distraction, but for connection, because sitting with women who knew what it meant to be quietly discarded reminded me who I was before Robert's neglect and Tina's entitlement dulled my edges. And when one woman asked why I was there, I simply said, "A man mistook my silence for permission." And that was enough, and days later Robert called with a limp apology, his voice thick with discomfort, not remorse, and I told him, "You're not sorry, you're just uncomfortable," then hung up, because closure isn't owed, especially to men who broke things and expected you to clean it up quietly. And not long after, Tina sent a party invitation, labeled relaunch, as if being evicted was just a spiritual detour. And I laughed hard, tossed it in the trash, and made tea, because I wasn't the one who needed rebirth. I had already risen, and that weekend, watching the first tulip bloom on my balcony, I felt peace, real peace. The kind that doesn't beg, doesn't explain, doesn't look back. And I whispered thanks, not to them, but to myself, for leaving before I forgot how to grow. The last time I saw Robert wasn't dramatic. It was at a farmer's market between a honey stand and a soap stall, and I was holding sunflowers, wearing my favorite wide-brimmed hat, feeling like the woman I used to set aside for someone else's comfort, and he froze when he saw me, older now, not just in face but in posture. Like a man realizing too late the house he lost wasn't brick and wood, but history, and I gave him a nod, no smile, no wave, because dignity is quiet. And I turned before he could speak, before his regret could try and rewrite my ending, because I wasn't interested in his sorrow, his spin, or his story. And later that day, I dropped off sweet potato muffins at the shelter and sat with women who knew what it meant to be erased politely, and in their company I found the truth. I wasn't rebuilding, I was rising, not from ashes, but from choice. And that night, Tyler asked if I ever missed it, the house, the marriage, the man, and I looked at the garden we planted together and said, "No, baby. I don't miss what I had to burn to find the light." And after he left, I lit a single candle for the girl I used to be. The one who made space for people who wouldn't even look her in the eye while they left her behind. As the flame danced in the quiet, I felt not survival, not revenge, but sovereignty. And in the morning I made my tea, stepped into the sunlight, and smiled. Because no one else was holding the pen anymore, just me.